Okay, today I was just hoping to shoot through this part of the module on sleep and sexual arousal or sexual, what was it? Sexual behavior. This slide here basically just shows how much sleep is required across the spectrum of mammals, and man, of course, lands somewhere in the middle. Studies on sleep haven't been that productive in explaining how much sleep an organism needs, but basically circadian rhythm is the most important thing, and every species has its own circadian rhythm. It is known that it's not totally true that the more work you do, the more sleep that you need. That basically is illustrated by a horse only needing a couple of hours sleep and a cat sleeping 15 hours a day, when in the past the horse was the one that did all the work and the cat basically just laid around the house. The most important thing about sleep is recognizing the stages, and after all is said and done, it seems that most important thing is how much time we spend in stage 3 and stage 4, the deepest sleep, where the delta waves are seen on the EEG. The previous stages are basically just a way of getting to stage 3 and stage 4. It was once thought that REM, rapid eye movement sleep, was most important. And apparently it is important, but the exact reasons there's still debate on it. I know clinically, sleep is probably the #1 complaint of patients that I see. And it turns out that treating sleep long-term with pharmacological agents is not a good idea, not productive. And the school of thought at this time is using agents such as Ambien or Lunesta or some of the other products is good for short-term use up to 3 or 4 weeks. But after that period of time, if the person's not sleeping, you really aren't helping them that much if you're aiding their sleep too much there. The real issue that needs to be addressed is something called sleep hygiene. And what that boils down to is basically having the same routine of approaching sleep, avoiding too much caffeine, alcoholic beverages, too much stimulus in the bedroom. Some sleep experts recommend not even having a television in the bedroom, anything that distracts from sleep. And the bedroom is basically used for 2 things, and that's sleep and sex. And all other activities should take place somewhere else. If there are issues with sleep, if you are sleeping well and getting the proper amount of sleep, then it's not a problem. But from what I've seen, sleep is one of the more serious issues that people try to get help for. Only other thing that's close to that is anxiety. And anxiety is usually related to some external factor that hasn't been resolved. And this is just a chart showing that we spend most of our time awake, but we spend up to 8 hours sleeping, and most of that is in the non-REM phase. The REM phase is only a short period of the sleep cycle, and that is shown through this bar right here with the various peaks. So the basic sleep cycle is starting at the hypnagogic state, where a patient or person is partially asleep, partially awake. And interestingly, this is the only time that it's normal to have hallucinations. So during this first few minutes, if a person does seem to hallucinate, then that's normal. It can happen to me, you, or anyone else. And the first couple of phases of sleep, again, as I said, are basically just to catapult the person to the delta wave sleep, which a person is in and out of. And as the waking state is approached, the person goes back through the phases of sleep until they reach the waking state. The rapid eye movement phase is usually due to dreams occurring, and they're usually pretty vivid dreams. The usefulness of these dreams has not been totally agreed upon, but we do know that in order to have restful sleep, rapid eye movement sleep is necessary. And this PowerPoint is just comparing the early slow wave sleep to the rapid eye movement sleep and what is actually occurring with the body there. Interestingly, the rapid eye movement phase is when the brain is most active, even though the body is not active at all. There is a condition known as sleep paralysis. I've experienced this myself, and it is very frightening when you can't move and you're thinking that you're awake, but you're really not awake, and you're spending tremendous amounts of energy trying to just move. And if I could just roll off the bed, I'd be okay, but you can only move a tiny bit, if any, and you can scream as loud as you can, but nothing's really coming out, and that can be terrifying. And especially if you're lying next to someone and you're trying to communicate with them to please wake me up, and they never do it. It's just not a pleasant thing. It isn't harmful, but it's something that's probably happened to most people at one time or another. Again, the functions of rapid eye movement sleep. There are theories about why we do it, but bottom line, it really is not completely understood. The effects of sleep deprivation. The school of thought at this time is that it is probably overrated of the damage that sleep deprivation causes, because for certain individuals, they basically are not negatively affected by being deprived of sleep. However, we do know that one thing that can happen is it can lower the seizure threshold if a person goes without their normal level of sleep. And this concept of micro sleeps, there is some validity to it, that it can rejuvenate certain individuals. But most of the sleep studies have been done on animals, and animals are really hard to control as far as things that stress them and de-stress them, and them also being able to communicate what's going on. But again, bottom line, overall, stage 3 and 4 sleep are the most important phase of sleep, and the earlier stages are just a way of getting to a stage 3 and 4. So it takes a few hours for a person to go through all the stages of sleep. And in order to get restful sleep, a person needs to establish a routine to where they're basically repeating the same set of behaviors every night. And in this fast-paced society, that's difficult to happen in the way that nature intended for it to happen. Melatonin is the sleep hormone that's produced in the pineal gland, and melatonin helps to keep our circadian rhythm intact. And the main thing is that our brain realizes that when the sun goes down, it's time to go to sleep, and that's how our bodies pretty much evolved. But there are environments now where the sun may not go down as far as the brain is sensing it because of electricity and lights being on all the time, such as Las Vegas would be a good example of that, where if you were inside a dwelling gaming, then you could stay in there for days and it would appear the same all the time. You wouldn't have a normal circadian rhythm because the sun and moon are not in their natural places of function. We know that the most important areas of the brain that are involved with sleep are the hypothalamus. It plays a role in waking and in sleeping. And of course, the reticular activating system, which is located in the pons in the brainstem. There have been various studies of animals there where certain parts were deactivated, and it was realized that especially in the upper part of this particular area, there is a major role in constant sleep and not being able to awaken properly. And it's also been shown that stimulating certain areas will affect sleep. And clinically, there are basically two pathological conditions. One is narcolepsy, where the brainstem is understimulated and the person can just fall asleep at the drop of a hat without even thinking about it. And they immediately go from fully awake to a deep state of sleep, along with cataplexy. And this can be a problem if a person has a certain occupation, which they would not be able to continue if they were diagnosed with narcolepsy. Basic treatments or medication called Provigil and one called Nuvigil. Also, the amphetamines or Ritalin have been used with some success to help this disorder, but it can be potentially dangerous if a person is diagnosed with narcolepsy. Sleep apnea is also frequently diagnosed. There are two types of sleep apnea. There's central sleep apnea, and there's obstructive sleep apnea, which is more common. Central sleep apnea occurs in the pons or hypothalamus, and there is a defect there that will cause a person to stop breathing while they're asleep. And this can be frightening if you're sleeping next to someone and you realize they stop breathing for 2 or 3 minutes. Not to mention the damage that it can cause to the brain due to lack of oxygen, and can lead to other problems such as hypertension, depression, and other things that happen to the brain that cause it not to function the way that it is intended to function. So it can be physically harmful as well as psychologically harmful. The more common type is obstructive sleep apnea, and it is seen most often in people that snore, and it is an anatomical issue. People that have short necks, there's a certain anatomy where the neck is short and the airway is short and the tongue falls back into the airway and shuts it off, and the person cannot get air in or out for several minutes, and this may happen up to maybe 100 times a night during a typical night for someone with a severe case of obstructive sleep apnea. And you can imagine how much stress this would put on the brain, being deprived of oxygen for extended periods of time repeatedly. And also the health of the person is affected with making conditions such as hypertension worse. As I said, it's an extremely common condition. Usually as people get older, they gain significant weight. And this also can cause the airway to become less patent and worsen this condition. So sometimes a person may present for depressive illness or other reasons, and it's found out that this is what they are diagnosed with. And to officially make the diagnosis, there needs to be a sleep study done with the EEG machine and with the sleep study team monitoring the person through a routine night of sleep and recording the number of times that they stop breathing. The most common treatment, of course, is something called CPAP, which is constant airway pressure control, I think, but it's keeping a positive pressure on the lungs so that the airway never really closes. There are other devices that are used in the mouth, but I don't think they have really been FDA approved, but they may work for some people. There's a condition called rapid eye movement behavioral disorder, which is basically when a person is in REM sleep and they are dreaming deeply and they're not properly paralyzed, and they tend to physically act out what they're going through in the dream, and they may be fighting or running or screaming or whatever's happening in the dream. They actually act it out, and that's why it's important that the body is able to paralyze itself during periods of sleep. The bottom line of all this that I've gone through is basically, if you're having problems sleeping, you have to work on your sleep hygiene. And if it's a serious problem, needs to be assessed by a sleep specialist to develop the best program. In the past, one of the mistakes we have made is using sedatives and CNS depressants too long. They are not intended to be used more than a few weeks in most cases. However, there are some psychiatric conditions that it is appropriate to use the medications long term based on a risk benefit assessment. And that means that if the person doesn't sleep, it's going to cause them more damage than if you give them something to help them get to sleep. But person has to be monitored closely for potential abuse. It's usually a problem if they're abusing other substances or if they have a substance abuse diagnosis. That is the bane of existence for the psychiatrist, is a substance abuser that does not think they're a substance abuser and do not want to deal with the problem. It only gets worse over time. So basically, here are the tips of sleep management and sleep hygiene. Is a regular time of going to bed and getting up, and especially getting up. No matter what time a person goes to bed, they should get up at the same time, and that will avoid messing up the circadian rhythm. However, if a person is getting up at different times of the day, the brain does not know what's going on. It doesn't know when to put the melatonin into the system, and it's really hard to get back on track. So worst job a person can have is a swing shift job where they are working different shifts and having to readjust their time for going to bed. That is totally unnatural. Even if you only get 3 hours sleep, it's important to get up at the same time every day. And minimizing the use of alcohol and caffeine. Those are the most commonly used substances that affect sleep. And becoming dependent on sleeping pills is not a good idea for the average person, unless they are suffering from a condition maybe such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, or are under the care of a sleep specialist. Rituals are important to cue the body when it's time to sleep. And the number one rule, make the bed for two things. That's for sleeping and for intimate relations. All other activities should be relegated to some other part of the home. All right. These are the slides of Dr. Adams, so I'm not totally up to date on them, but for this particular module, it is actually designed to be self-study mostly. The scripts are very good, and they have all the information that you really need. So make sure that you study the scripts carefully And any test material or material that's to be discussed will be included in those. And they just go in more detail in the PowerPoints here. As far as sexual behavior, I think the most important parts in this is going to be the role of testosterone, which does not explain everything, but it is a factor that is quite important. This was the first time I ever saw this term, mama wawa, and that, of course, means man and man always, woman and woman always. In the society we live today, there are a lot of different options of what a person's gender is, and basically everything has become socially acceptable, which is not really a problem, but unfortunately our country is, how do I put this? Mostly religiously oriented, and some people are very rigid in their beliefs. But I think an interesting point is that in embryonic development, at a certain stage, we all are biologically females, which means we have the influence of the X chromosome, which we receive from our mother. And even with a Y chromosome, until a certain protein kicks in, it doesn't activate the system to develop into a male or a female. That's the Wolffian and the Mullerian stages of development. The Wolffian is the male. So in the beginning, we all are technically females until the effect of that protein in the testosterone acts on the Y chromosome of the prospective male, that a differentiation occurs. If fetus receives 2 X chromosomes, it's a moot point, because they are technically a female. XX is female, XY is male. So it's important to understand those basics of genetics and the effect of hormones, especially testosterone, is a major factor. And this just talks a little bit about what I was just saying. It's the SRY gene on the Y chromosome that activates the protein that starts male development. And this is the Wolffian system and Mullerian system that I had mentioned. So in embryonic development, before differentiation occurs, the male develops a penis under the influence of testosterone, and clitoris comes from the same tissue that the penis is developed from. And once differentiation occurs, you either develop a scrotum or labia tissue. There is also influence from the hypothalamus in the brain, which helps to regulate the gonads and glands via the pituitary system. There are, of course, incidents where normal development doesn't take place, and the phenomenon of a hermaphrodite is a possibility where a person can have both male and female genitalia, but that is not something that we are interested in at this particular point in this class. So most of the controversy today is probably in the transsexual population, where many people have their own beliefs and disagree about certain things there. And the question is, are you a man or are you a woman, or should you change your body? And that is a case that should be discussed somewhere else. It's not our place to make judgments about that. But it's important to have a understanding of the science behind the development of how we become male or female. Probably the least understood part is the fact that the hypothalamus and other parts of the brain play in a person's sexual orientation. There's probably a lot that we'll learn about this in the future. There are arguments about whether a person has any control of whether they're homosexual or heterosexual. The interesting thing there is that there have always been homosexuals. Certain portion of the population, about 10%, has always been there and still remains there, and it's not likely to change. And another question that comes into that is that since homosexuals aren't able to reproduce with each other, how do they keep surviving? So it must be something intricate in development that plays a role in that. And this is speaking of the effect of testosterone and the hypothalamus, right, in this slide. And we do know that testosterone is the biggest factor, though it's not the only factor in influencing sex. And it has actually very little to do with sexual preference. So that is probably something in the development of the brain that determines that. Bottom line, we don't really know at this point. And sometimes it's important to say that we don't know and not always try to explain things away by religious beliefs or other ways of explaining things that aren't scientifically based. Again, hypothalamus comes up, the basal ganglia, and of course, nucleus accumbens plays a role in orgasm, pleasure. The amygdala plays a role in stimulation from partners. And of course, the cortex is usually involved in some way in about everything. But again, specifics are not totally determined at this time. And as I spoke of previously, sexual identity, not completely understood. We do know that androgens play a role in physical masculinity, but that really doesn't determine the sexual preference, but does play a role in the sexual identity. With enough androgens, the person is pretty much going to identify as a male, whether they started out as a female or started out as a male. And estrogen, of course, enough of that is going to physically feminize or make more feminine a male. Probably very little effect on a female. That is part of the process of sex change operations, is providing estrogen therapy to cause the breasts to develop and the subject to become more feminized, if that is what they seek. That is congruent with their personality. Case of John and Joan, I didn't read that yet, but I think you should probably read it to maybe understand more deeply about this subject. The ontogeny of sexual orientation, and that basically looks at the individual case of what happens. That's usually studied by looking at twins, monozygotic and dizygotic. Of course, monozygotic have identical DNA, and dizygotic have half of the same DNA. We know that the genes are passed down through the maternal side. Most subjects realize their sexual orientation around the age as early as 3 years old, but usually not expressed till around age 10. And a lot has to do with the action of the steroids as they approach puberty. Most of the studies were done in animals again. There are theories about fraternal birth order that play into this, but there is no proof. Independence of identity versus orientation is another theory. But due to the fact that there's so much unresolved science here, this should be a very interesting discussion. And I really want to examine some of your thoughts and ideas here. Probably on the exam, I'm not sure yet, but there probably won't be a ton of scientific information. I do expect you to know about the role of testosterone and the role of the brain in sexual development. And a lot of this is cultural, social. If you're going into psychology, you will realize that this is a very common area that's going to come up a lot, usually because subjects going through conflict here are usually having problems with their support system, usually due to religious reasons or feelings of rejection from various family members, and they need help from someone who is objective in their thinking and able to fill in that support that may be lacking or may be causing them to have a serious conflict. Many times subjects have committed suicide due to the pressure and the guilt of not feeling socially accepted. And that is serious because in most cases, once the support system, family accepts the person, they reach a point where it doesn't matter anymore, the difference there, and they are able to repair that support system. I guess a parallel would pretty much be the way that interracial relationships have evolved over time. What I've seen in most cases here in the South is that once the family accepts that person that their loved one has chosen, they over time realize that that person is really no different than they are, and they have a lot of the same qualities, and they're able to overcome that prejudice. Interestingly, this is probably related to the amygdala in the brain, where we're afraid of things that are different. But if we face it or try it, we eventually realize that there is no reason to be afraid, and that that's not the smart thing to do, and that the cerebral cortex frontal lobe will eventually triumph there, and we continue to grow and evolve. But at this point, just study the scripts there. Has everything you need to know. And I'm gonna meet with you again next Wednesday, and we'll see where we are at that time. The discussion should be open, so I would like you to go ahead and start posting there. And most important thing about these discussions is that you're participating and you're demonstrating that you understand what's going on. It's impossible for everyone to make a super post, but it's kind of like theater. Some people will be the stars and some people will be the supporting actors there. So person who wins that supporting actor or actress role, they usually aren't disappointed when the Oscars happen. But just make sure that you participate and you got a decent score just by participating. But if you don't participate, then I don't have anything to grade you on or judge you by.
Okay, I just had one question. The link to upload the essay questions for the exam 2 is not working. It won't let us upload anything. And on here, it says that it was closed on the 13th. So it was closed last Wednesday. And I think that's probably why it won't let us.
Okay, did it work the last exam?
The last exam, it was not working at the beginning. And then I think somebody said that they contacted you and then it started working.
Okay, let me look in there now, actually, while you're here. Okay, where am I looking? Quizzes. Okay. So 1, exam 3. Where is exam 2?
If you go into assignments, I don't know if it's the same on your end, but on my end, if I go into assignments, I can see the midterm short essays and it's like close to the bottom of my thing.
Bottom.
No, I don't have all that. So it's not going to be on your bottom. I think yours is showing stuff for the whole.
Okay, let me see midterm short
Yep.
essay. Okay, according to here, it's published. Okay, are you getting this box here at all? Or?
Yeah, so that box shows for us, but it just says cannot upload submission. And then when you click on the little information link, it says that the due date was October 13th, which was like before it was even opened. And so that late submissions are not allowed, is what it says.
Let me make sure I change that to October 13th. Thanks for letting me know that. And if it's not open in the next hour, just send me an email and I'll get in touch with the IT people. Are there any other concerns today? If not, I'm gonna plan to see y'all next Wednesday, and I'll work on this right now. And y'all have a good week.
Thank you. Have a good week.
Thank you.